All right. Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see all of you. I know it's a large crowd, but it's going to be a wonderful event tonight. My name is Bridget Terry Long, and I'm the Academic Dean here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. It is my pleasure to welcome you here this evening to tonight's Askwith Forum. The Askwith Forums feature a wide range of topics and invite leaders in their fields, as we have tonight, to address the highest priority challenges facing education. These forums help strengthen the intellectual life of our community through conversation, debate, and the exchange of ideas. They also allow us to open our doors and welcome members of the greater Harvard community and the public at large. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome members of the Charles William Eliot and Paul Hannis Societies. We also welcome participants in the program Race, Equity, and Leadership in Schools, a programs and professional education convening. So how many of you are here for that program? That's truly excellent. That program and this Askwith Forum are integral parts in a broader series of conversations our community has been having about racial equity. Racial equity in our schools can only be achieved if issues of race are confronted head on. In other words, we have to talk about it. Racial equity, I cannot imagine anyone more capable of helping us have that conversation about racial equity than tonight's featured guest, Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. Scholar, teacher, author, administrator, and as many of you know, Dr. Tatum stands as an outstanding example of leadership. Dr. Tatum is President Emerita of Spelman College, having served as president. Having served as president from 2002 to 2015. Her tenure as president marked a period of great innovation and growth. As part of a successful $158 million campaign, scholarship support for Spelman students doubled. Come on. And opportunities for faculty research and development expanded significantly. Among her other accomplishments, Dr. Tatum championed women in STEM fields. The National Science Foundation reported that from 1997 to 2006, Spelman prepared more African-American women to earn PhDs in STEM than Georgia Tech, Duke, and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill combined. During her tenure, the Center for Leadership and Civic Engagement was also created, and they established the annual Women of Color Leadership Conference. In 2013, Dr. Tatum was awarded the Carnegie Corporation Academic Leadership Award, which recognizes exceptional presidents at U.S. colleges and universities. Before Spelman, Dr. Tatum served as chair of the psychology department, dean of college, and then acting president of Mount Holyoke College. Widely known for her expertise in race relations, she's author of such important books as Can We Talk About Race and Other Conversations in an Era of School Resegregation, published in 2007. Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And Other Conversations About Race, originally published in 1997. An update of this best-selling book will be released in fall 2017 to commemorate the 20th anniversary. As these titles suggest, Dr. Tatum does not shy away from asking hard questions or talking about issues that are often difficult to discuss. To quote her, "It is important to understand that the system of advantage is perpetuated when we do not acknowledge its existence." On behalf of students, faculty, and staff at HGSE, I want to thank you, Dr. Tatum, for joining us this evening. I also want to thank my colleagues, Deborah Jewell-Sherman and Grassa O'Neill, who have used their considerable talent and a great deal of effort putting together the program Race, Equity, and Leadership in Schools and organizing this forum tonight. Deborah is professor of practice at HGSE, and she's the first woman to hold that title. She served as superintendent of Richmond, Virginia Public Schools from 2002 to 2008, and has built a reputation as one of the most successful urban district superintendents in the country. During her tenure, 95% of Richmond's lowest performing schools achieved full accreditation under Virginia's standards of learning legislation. and she was named the Virginia Superintendent of the Year in 2009 by the Virginia Association of School Superintendents. A proud alumna of HGSE, earning both her master's and doctoral degrees here, she returned in 2008 and has served as faculty director of the Urban Superintendents Program. She's currently a core faculty member for the Doctorate in Education Leadership, or EDLD program. Mary Grassa O'Neill is Senior Lecturer in Education and Faculty Director of the School Leadership Program here at HGSE. She's former Secretary of Education and Superintendent of the Archdiocese of Boston. In this role, she revitalized and reinvigorated education in the second largest school district in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. She also served 10 years as superintendent of the Milton Public Schools. Here at HGSE, she's the former managing director for programs on professional education, where she oversaw executive education programs for over 6,000 professionals each year. And she holds her doctorate in instructional leadership from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and has won many awards and honors for her contributions to education. So together, they are co-chairs of this program. And so please join me in a warm welcome for Deborah, Mary, and Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. Tatum. A little tongue-tied here.
Thank you, Bridget.
So, thank you all for being here. What a wonderful assemblage. Turn. There, good. Just in case you didn't know what you were here for. So, Beverly, Deborah, and Mary, and we have, we're going to do this in 4 acts or 4 sessions, and then we're going to turn it over to you for Q&A. We're using Marshall Gantz's public narrative format. So we'll have the story of self, the story of us, the story of now, and we'll close by now what, so what, in terms of what it is that we do. And so we're going to go ahead and get started with the story of self. And do you want to ask the first one?
So, story of self. Who are you in this work? How did you become the leader we see? And what life experiences and values have shaped you?
Well, first, let me begin by saying how happy I am to be here. I want to thank you all for coming and say that it's just delightful to look out and see some familiar faces, people I've known for a long time. So, not to mention the Spelmanites in the space. So, I am really, so the question is, how did I start?
Yes. How did you become the leader that we see?
Okay. Well, let me begin by saying that when I think about teaching about race, and of course that was really what moved me into a leadership role, was my work around talking about race. And that was something that I started somewhat serendipitously. I was 26 years old, newly married, living in California, having just left Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is where I was working on my doctorate in clinical psychology. And I was, as they say, ABD, right? Those of you in the audience in doctoral programs will know exactly what I mean by that. All but dissertation, and I was in need of a job. So I started, my husband had a job at UCSB, and I got a part-time job working in the campus counseling center, but I was offered an opportunity to do some teaching in the Black Studies department. So I taught a course on education and the black child. That was the first thing I taught. And that went pretty well. And so then they asked me if I would teach a course that they didn't have anyone to teach. And it was called Group Exploration of Racism. And the problem was that it was a required course for Black Studies majors, but the person who had created the course had left the university. So it was they needed somebody to teach it, and nobody wanted to. And I think it was because it was called Group Exploration, right? It wasn't a lecture course. It was really intended to deal with group process. But as a clinical psychologist, I knew how to facilitate groups. So I said, sure, I'll teach that. I thought in my 26-year-old self, how hard could that be? and so It was hard, but at the end of the semester, even though looking back on it, I can see I made a lot of mistakes. At the end of the semester, students wrote on their evaluations things like, "This course changed my life. I think everyone should be required to take this course. Why is it I had to wait till I was a senior in college to, talk about these issues?" I was getting that kind of feedback, and so I was very excited about the idea of continuing to teach that class. So we lived in Santa Barbara for 4 years, and I think I taught it 10 times. They're on the trimester system, and I was teaching that class a lot. And when we left California, I got my first tenure-track job at Westfield State College and here in Massachusetts at Westfield, Massachusetts. And when I was being interviewed, and I want to mention this because sometimes graduate students will ask, "How did you get to teach about race?" When I was being interviewed, I basically said, "I've been teaching this course on racism, and if I come here, I'd like to teach a course on the psychology of racism." And they said, "Okay." So, I had other things I was supposed to teach, of course, but it was the Psych of Racism class that became sort of my signature course, and I started writing about it, and one thing led to another. But what became, and I want to say this in the context of this conversation because I know that you're celebrating the 35th anniversary of the Principal Center.
That's right, yes.
If I'm not mistaken. And when I was teaching those students early on in my teaching career, the students would say, "Why did I have to wait till I was a junior, a senior in college to have these conversations? Why didn't we talk about this stuff when I was in high school or middle school?" And as I was doing professional conferences and I started writing about, in fact, I wrote my article that was in Harvard Ed Review in 1992, talking about race, learning about racism, the application of racial identity development in the classroom. And after that article came out in Harvard Ed, in the Harvard Ed Review, I started being invited to speak at educational conferences. And I would sometimes have classroom teachers, K through 12, in my audiences, and I would ask them, "Why don't you talk about these issues in your classrooms?" And they would say, "We don't know how." And so I started doing workshops for teachers, and then the teachers would say, "This is great, but really, the principals need this." And I started doing workshops for principals, and I got invited to speak a few summers, actually, at the Principals Institute. And then the principals would say, "This is really great, but it's the superintendents. It's the superintendents.
Just kick it upstairs, right?
It's the superintendents that need this." And then, as luck would have it, I got invited to speak at the Massachusetts Superintendents Conference. And then I started being invited to superintendents gatherings, and then the superintendents would say, "This is great, but those school committees, exactly, you need to come to my town," right? Because the school committees really need to understand this work. And I started giving talks in towns, but I was wearing myself out. And so then I thought, well, what I really need to do is write this down. So that's when I got the idea for writing "Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria?" Because that was the question people always asked me when I would show up, particularly in predominantly white districts or in racially mixed high schools. Inevitably, someone would say, "Why are all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria?" And I wanted to respond to that question and other questions about race. If you read the book, you know it's not just about that question. But anyway, then the book came out, and you'll hear this sort of pattern. I was speaking a lot about the book in different places, and people started asking me if I might like to come teach in those places. And I had been teaching at Mount Holyoke. By that time, I was at Mount Holyoke, and I'd been there for quite a while. And I was chair of my department, which I did not like, being chair of the department. Department chairs will appreciate why that is. But and I was thinking that maybe I needed a change. I was ready for a change. But I didn't want to leave Mount Holyoke because I had 2 kids who were at awkward ages, for moving. I think 7 and 11 or something like that. I didn't want to move them. And a friend of mine, a colleague, said, "Maybe you should be the dean." And I said, "Who in her right mind would want that?"
Dean sitting right.
That's what I said. And she said, well, you're not using your imagination. If you were the dean, you could take those things you've been writing about and really enact change here at Mount Holyoke. And I began to think about that as an interesting idea. And so I decided to apply to be the dean, and I got that job. And so then I was dean, and I found they were right, that it really was a much more interesting job than I could possibly have imagined. And so I enjoyed being dean, and then and I wasn't thinking of myself as a leader. This is a long-winded story, but I wasn't thinking of myself as a leader until I was dean, and someone asked me to speak at a leadership conference. And it was then when I thought, about what? I mean, I wasn't thinking of myself as a leader in that sense, but then I began to see myself as what I would call a reluctant leader, which is, I was the kind of person that would see a problem and wonder why nobody was fixing it. And then I would say, well, I guess maybe I should fix it. That's kind of how that happened.
Well, before we get off your book, which is a favorite here, I'm sure amongst many, why were all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? We know this is the 20th anniversary of that book, and there's something special happening. So maybe we'll let you tell us about that,
So
please.
I'm very excited about the fact that this is fall 2017 will be the 20th anniversary of the publication of that book, which has been widely read, and I'm very grateful for that. And the publisher asked me if I would revise it for the 20th anniversary republication, and so I have essentially rewritten the book. So it's not. It is, I often say, for people who have read the original, you will recognize it as the same book. But I would say at least half, maybe 60% of it is new content. So I'm hoping people will read it again.
I have a feeling they will.
Yeah.
So, okay, so that's how you got to where you are.
Yeah.
My question in the story of self is this. You've really helped define terms that help us have a common vocabulary and understanding about race. Would you share your meaning of some of those terms with our audience? Terms like racism, individual racism, institutional racism, interpersonal racism, privilege, and ally. You don't have to define all of them.
Thank you.
But just as importantly, why is having a shared vocabulary important to the work of ensuring excellence and equity for all?
Sure. Well, let me say that if you've read Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, you know that the first chapter is all about defining terms. And one of the reasons I thought it was important to do the book in that way, though I also know for some people that's a hard chapter because not everyone agrees with my definitions, but that said, it seems at least it puts us all on the same plane in terms of having the conversation. So as I define racism, for example, as a system of advantage based on race, that definition doesn't originate with me. I first learned of it from David Wellman's work. He wrote a book a long time ago called Portraits of White Racism, in which he defined racism as a system of advantage that people will often defend even if they are not overtly even they're benefiting, but even if they're not overtly racist in terms of actively prejudice. Like many people think of prejudice and racism as interchangeable, but of course they are not. We think about prejudice as individual attitudes, but racism is much more, it's a system. Just like sexism is a system, or classism is a system, or heterosexism is a system, et cetera. So if you think about that system, it operates even if you yourself are not actively embracing prejudicial attitudes. Unless you're actively working against that system, you can certainly be part of its perpetuation. So when we talk about racism as a system of advantage based on race, it's also clear that some people are systematically advantaged by it, others are systematically disadvantaged by it. In the context of U.S. society, we're talking about white people systematically being advantaged. And for some people, that is an uncomfortable idea because they don't necessarily think of themselves as systematically advantaged. But I think if we are honest about the way systems operate in our society, whether we're talking about school, education, or criminal justice, or economics, or all kinds of things, we can see the way the advantage is built in.
Thank you. Mary?
So as we move to the story of us,
Yes.
do you think everyone is affected by racism?
No, there's no question.
And how is race impacting the education of school children in America?
I'm sighing because that's a long question, a long answer.
You can give us your short answer.
Well, I'm going to give you, I'm going to refer to another book. I wrote another book in 2007 called Can We Talk About Race and Other Conversations in an Era of School Resegregation. And one of the things I talked about in the first chapter of that book is the fact that schools have resegregated over the last 20, 30 years and how it was that that happened. And without retracing that history, I think it's, the short version of that history is, one Supreme Court decision after another has since Nixon, has systematically dismantled Brown versus Board of Education. And even just, in the last few weeks, we saw the news in Kentucky that the Kentucky legislature has just voted to return to neighborhood schools. And so if you've got a history of neighborhood segregation and you rely on neighborhood schooling for your assignments, you're going to have segregated schools because we still have segregated neighborhoods. And we know the way schools are funded and the economic discrimination that exists, you're going to have inequitable funding if you're doing it neighborhood by neighborhood. So there are lots of ways, obviously, that racism impacts the delivery of education in terms of how schools are structured, how schools are funded, and then we can talk about the individual attitudes or assumptions that are made about student capabilities. All of that relates to race, equity, and leadership.
So we know that these problems exist, but it's not easy for most of us to talk about race. What would make it easier? In Mary and my teaching here at HGSE, we often find that when conversations get specific about race, including historical and current realities, sometimes the conversation bogs down. For different reasons, groups of people seem reticent and even afraid to speak.
Yeah.
What do we need to know to break through the impasse that prevents having and staying in the conversation?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that it's not a surprise that these conversations are hard, right? We have a long history of not talking about race. Some people would say we talk about it too much. I always say we don't talk about it nearly enough, and that the conversations do get bogged down. But I want to just go back to a little bit of personal history, and I'm going to ask the audience a question. So raise your hand if you've had a difficult conversation with somebody about a race-related topic. So everybody's hand is up virtually. Maybe there are a few people who don't have hands up, but it looked like everybody's hand was up. And if you have, just as human beings, right, we tend to avoid discomfort. So if you're having uncomfortable conversations, and everybody's had that experience, you are likely to avoid them because we all are inclined to avoid, seek pleasure, avoid pain. And if you think about our experiences as young children, I'm going to ask another question. How many of you can think of an early race-related memory? Okay, many people. And I'm going to now do a little survey. It's audience participation. How old are you? The thing you thought of, how old are you? You can just call out your ages.
7.
Okay, I heard some 3s, 4s, 5s. I heard 7. I heard 14. 7.
11.
Oh, 11.
11.
Okay, and I'm sure there's some other ages in there that I didn't hear, but there was a sort of group cohesion around 4, 5, and 7. So a lot of people had kindergarten, first grade, early elementary school experiences. And so what do we know about early elementary school children? Think about that for just a moment. What feeling is attached to that experience you remembered? You can call out some words. Honesty? Shock. Confusion. Curiosity.
Sadness,
Sadness, someone said. Fear? Guilt? Embarrassment? Confusion? So we've heard a bunch of different words, and curiosity we might think of as neutral. Someone said honesty, but we also heard fear, we heard embarrassment, we heard shock, we heard sadness, we heard confusion again. And there are some other words. I'm sure if we spent more time on this, we would hear other words. But most of those words, I would suggest, are associated with discomfort, right? I mean, certainly shock, embarrassment, confusion even. And so when you think about that, we have these early experiences. They're associated with discomfort. Raise your hand if you discussed your experience with a caring adult at the time that it occurred. If you look around, you'll see that relative to how many hands were up before, it's not very many. Mm-hmm. And now I'm coming back to what I started out with, which was think about early young kids, 5, 6, 7. If you know 5-year-olds and they're upset about something, you usually hear about it, right? You know, they don't have a lot of social filters. They, you hear about it and, you know, sometimes quite loudly. and so I just always find it interesting that so many people had early experiences and yet didn't talk to anybody about them, even though there was some discomfort attached to it. And when you think about why that is, I think it's pretty easy to see that we learn early on. You know, if we had more time, I'd ask you to tell me your theories, but I'm just going to say, we learn early on that we're not supposed to talk about it, that this is a taboo topic. We're not supposed to talk about it. Or sometimes when I question audiences, sometimes people will say, well, actually the person I would have talked to was the source of the confusion, right? You know, maybe the parent or the teacher is the person who did or said the thing that was upsetting or confusing. And so we have a long history. I mean, if you think about the fact that people are remembering things at 4 or 5, and I don't know about everybody else, but I am 62, and so that's, 58 years. My earliest memory is 3, so 59 years of stuff accumulating, and a lot of that associated with discomfort. So there's a long history of not talking, not knowing how to talk about it, and suppressing, I'm going to say, that information. And then we have courses like Race, Equity, and Leadership or Psychology of Racism, and we bring everybody in the room and we say, okay, now we're going to talk about it. And there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear and anxiety, and people struggle. Now, some of us have more experience talking about it, and certainly if you grow up in a family of color, if you grow up in an African-American family, as I did, you hear your parents talking about issues related to race, whether it's, talking about, I'm of the generation hearing people talk about Martin Luther King in real time when he was on television, that kind of stuff, or you hear people talking today. If people were to walk into my house, they would hear me and my husband talking every night about what's in the news today. But the fact of the matter is, some families don't have those conversations. And a lot of white students will say, we didn't talk about it in my family. And I was just recently having lunch with a white man in Atlanta who is the same age as me. He grew up in Texas, I grew up in Massachusetts, and he said, I grew up being told, don't ever mention it. So there is that history, and that's why I think when you are in a racially mixed group, like the kind of class you have been teaching, it's common for the white students to say, I just want to listen. But that's not the rules of engagement, right? Everybody has to participate. And so creating spaces where people feel courageous enough to do that is part of what we need to do.
Very often in class, not very often, but at the end of our class last year, we taught the Race, Equity, and Leadership class for the first time. Some of the students said, you make everything about black and white. And I know your research has covered lots of races, so I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Sure, yeah. Well, it's so interesting because I think that the nature of our history is certainly not exclusively black and white, but there is a fundamental nature of the racism as it is expressed in our society, going back to the time of slavery. Now, of course, we also have to talk about, the genocide of the Native Americans and, there's...
Japanese and
Yes, I mean, if you look over history, but I think there's a way in which people often come back to, the way, the Constitution the 3/5 of a person and all, it's sort of baked into the system. And I think that's part of why often those conversations are black and white. But it was really important to me when I was writing the first version of Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together that all of my students would see themselves represented in that book. And not all of my students were black or white. I mean, I had Asian students and Latino students and Native American students and biracial students. And so it was important to include those communities in the book. In the 20th anniversary edition, those sections have been expanded, in part because our demographics have shifted, right? So Latinos are the largest ethnic minority in the United States. The biracial, multiracial family population has grown quite a bit. And there's a lot more to say. And the new version of the book has a section talking about the experience of Muslim students in the U.S., which the first version had a paragraph. It's been expanded.
The story of now. So the story of now is about us doing this work and thinking about it. We've heard about you and some of the things that we struggle with together, but we've seen too many examples of racial, ethnic, religious, sexual orientation, and language occurrences. How do we address the root cause of this ignorance and some of the violence and just grossly inappropriate behaviors that we see one to another in our PK through 12 system, in our higher ed system, and in society?
Yeah, I really think that this is an issue of leadership. I want to talk about leadership for a moment. As human beings, we are inclined to think in us-them categories. We are innately programmed in some ways to do that. But who we think the us is and who we think the them is largely determined by the leaders, right? And the family leader, it's your mom, your parents you look to say, are these people in our circle or not in our circle? We get that feedback. And we, if we think, beyond the family to the community, to the neighborhood, to the town, to the city, to the nation, the leader makes a difference in terms of how the circle is defined, right? If you think about, the us as being the people inside our circle and the them, the people outside our circle, how is that circle being drawn? And is the circle being drawn narrowly, or is the circle being drawn in an inclusive way? And I believe that right now we are in a situation where we see circles being drawn quite narrowly. And it's quite remarkable, shocking maybe even, to see how quickly people fall into that pattern of narrowing their us-them thinking and, vilifying the them. We see lots of examples of that and saw it right after the election of 2016. And, fortunately, some of it seems to have, it's not occurring, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, not occurring at quite the same rate that it was in the first, 10 days after the election. But it's still happening. And we certainly know that the rhetoric is really problematic. I write in my book, in the new version of my book, I wrote a prologue. And in that prologue, the prologue is titled, Why Are All the Black Kids Still Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And Other Conversations in the 21st Century. And I kind of reflected, in that prologue, I reflect on the last 20 years, what's happened between 1997 and 2017. And of course, the prologue ends with the election of 2016 and its immediate aftermath. And I talk about reading, thinking about this at that time, I was reminded of a book I read a few years ago called Left to Tell by Immaculée Ilibagiza, is her last name. She's Rwandan, and she survived the Rwandan genocide. And she writes about her experience and how she survived. But in it, she talks about what was happening just before the genocide started. And that was the rhetoric on the radio. You know, there was all this ethnic demonization by the leaders who were in the majority against the ethnic minority of which she was a part. And you know, we know how that story went. I mean, it translated into violence, and you know, it was a real demonization. People being talked about like, you know, roaches that need to be stamped out kind of language. But while I certainly don't want to suggest that we are in a moment like that necessarily, I do think that words matter and leadership matters. And when you have some of what we see today, I think it's really a concern. But that is why the leadership of school leaders and local leaders is so critical, I think, to keep us thinking about how that circle could be wider, more inclusive.
One of the things you write about, Beverly, as being really important are the ABCs
Yes.
of creating positive learning environments. So would you just give us,
Sure.
you can give us the A and give us an example, and then the B,
Sure.
the affirming,
Yeah.
the building, the cultivating.
Yeah, so let me say, so I talked about being the dean, right?
Yes.
So when I became dean of the college at Mount Holyoke, I gathered all the people in the area that I was responsible for, was all the student affairs people and the undergraduate deans, the academic advisors, and I brought everybody together and I talked about the fact that my goal as dean was for us to affirm the identities of all of our students, to build a community where everyone felt included, and to cultivate the leadership of our students, the next generation of leaders. And I wasn't working on an acronym when I said it, but those three things became known as the ABCs: affirming identity, building community, and cultivating leadership. And the A, affirming identity, was really important. It continues to be very important, I think, for every learning environment. And it's easily communicated in the sense that we all want to see ourselves reflected in the environments where we are, and see ourselves affirmed in those and the identities that are important to us. And the way that I often communicate this to audiences, I will use here, this analogy here, is to imagine, if you all imagined that we had a photographer on stage with us. And if that photographer took a picture of a group photo, right? And everyone got a copy of their photo on the way out the door, what is the first thing you're going to do when you get your picture?
Look for yourself.
It is the only answer, right? That is the only answer. No one says, I'm looking for Beverly. You look for yourself. And so you want to see yourself in the picture. And not only, first you're going to see if you're in the picture, and then you're going to assess whether you're looking good, right? Mm-hmm. Are my eyes closed? I should have taken off my name tag. You know what I mean? All that kind of stuff. We all want to see ourselves in the picture. And if you think about the classroom space, the curriculum, if you think about the learning environments as like a big photograph, you enter those spaces, you want to see yourself. And if you don't, you wonder, what's wrong with that picture? If the photographer were really here and taking, those really good photographers will keep moving you around. They'll say, I can't see you. If you can't see me, I can't see you. You in the yellow shirt, straighten your tie, whatever it might be. And then, when everybody is visible and looking good, they take the picture. But let's imagine you had one of these every day. Let's imagine. Every day, and every day they take a picture, and every day, but the picture's taken at the very end. And every day people get their photos, and there are a few people in here who each time have been digitally removed. So they get their picture and they're not in it. And they're like, what's wrong with this? But I don't know how many times it would take, but eventually the photographer is going to say, don't leave, don't go anywhere, I'm going to take this picture. But the people who never show up in the picture are going to say, I'm not hanging around for this, I'm out of here. I'm getting to the parking lot first, or the restroom, or whatever it might be. And so when we think about creating learning environments where you have routinely people left out of the picture, it's not a surprise that they don't want to fully engage. So if you want people to fully engage, they have to feel like they're being affirmed in that space. Now, but in order to do that, you have to build community. You have to affirm identity, but you also want to build community. Every school environment talks about building community. As president of Spelman College, I'm talking about building community. Everybody is. But you can't build community unless you think about affirming identity. And I'm going to give you a very simple example. When you come to Spelman at the beginning of the school year, new students are arriving, and you have, this is what year we're in, 2017. So the students who come in the fall will be the class of 2021. Am I right? Yes. Okay. So let's imagine the class of 2021 is arriving for new student orientation, and there's a big sign that says, "Welcome, class of 2021." That's great if you're in the class of 2021. But if you're a transfer student, you're a new student, but you're not in the class of 2021. And so you're like, I've just arrived, I'm seeing what looks like a picture of the class, except I'm not in it, right? So that welcome sign is intended to help build community, right? But it doesn't work for everyone. It would be much better, and this is what happened at Spelman, we had to change our signs when, became clear we were leaving people out. And so the sign now says, welcome new students. All the new students are included, and of course, those who are members of the class of 2021, or, when I was there, class of 2018 or whatever, want to feel acknowledged, and there's ways to do that, but we have to think about who's missing from the picture. And if you get in the habit of mind of thinking who's missing from the picture, you'll do things differently, which help you build community more effectively. And those students around you, or those staff members around you who are helped to think about who are we leaving out when we do it this way, we're cultivating their leadership and helping them to think about how to lead effectively in a diverse community.
So it was a great example. It's a small change
Yes.
with major impact.
Yes.
Before we leave the story of now, are there sites that you can share with us as places where the Black kids, the white kids, the Latino kids, Asian, Native American kids, on and on, aren't sitting by themselves in the cafeteria?
Well, let me say that I hear about places. I can't say that I've been in those places, but when I give talks, like here, sometimes someone will come up to me and say, at my school it wasn't like that. And when you ask more questions about it, what you'll learn often is that there's been a leader who's been very intentional about creating opportunities for kids to engage across lines of difference. I'm going to think, for example, right now, it came to me as we were speaking, I spent some time in October of this year, October 2016, at the University of Michigan, visiting with David Shom, who is a faculty member there, and he runs something called the Michigan Community Scholars Program. The Michigan Community Scholars Program is a residential living learning community where first-year students, when they apply and they're getting their housing assignment, can request to be part of this living learning community, which is intentionally diverse. So it's 50% kids of color, 50% white students, something like that, quite diverse, certainly more diverse than any of the local Michigan communities that the students have come from. And not only do they live in the same building, there's maybe 100 of them. Now, Michigan has thousands of students, so this is a small program in the context of a much larger university, but in that small program, the students are not only living in a residential community, but they're engaged in intergroup dialogue and structured conversations with skilled facilitators as part of that living learning experience. And when I visited in October, they were telling me about, the students who participate were telling me about how beneficial it was to them to be in an environment where they felt like they could talk about things. And this was pre-election, right? So we know what, a lot of campuses were kind of hot, if you know what I'm talking about. Little hot in terms of, the dialogue that was happening in terms of the election. And at Michigan, unfortunately, they'd had some postering of the campus by white supremacists who had some very explicit anti-black rhetoric on their posters talking about intellectual inferiority and other things. And I remember this young African-American woman who was a first-year student talking about how stressful this was for her. And she talked about, and here's an education moment, she's talking about what it's like to be sitting in her geology class, and her geology professor is talking about the names of rocks, and she can't concentrate on the names of rocks because she's thinking about those posters, right? And so you think about, how that's impacting her education in a way that it's not impacting white students who may feel bad about those posters but aren't distracted by them in the same way that she's being distracted. But then she talks about, going back to her, and also because you don't know who put up the posters, you don't know who in your environment is feeling that way about you.
I suspect everyone.
Yeah, so it's very hard to feel safe. But she felt like when she got back to this multiracial community where they'd been talking about issues of race together, that was a place where she could relax and could trust the people that she was living with, and that was really important to her. So that's an example
of creating.
Creating that kind of community. But I do want to say it doesn't happen without intention.
No question.
Yeah.
So the last one before we turn it over to all of you
Time
is...
flies.
That's because pearls of wisdom. Just now what, so what, do what? How do we start? About 150 people are here for the Institute. Everyone is here because they're interested in changing the national narrative and having impact and ensuring excellence and equity. So,
If there are 3 things we could do moving forward,
well,
that would
I won't surprise you by saying we could have conversations about race.
Check.
That is, I think, really important. And you'd be surprised, maybe you wouldn't be surprised, but still there are a lot of people who just are really not wanting to have that conversation. And a lot of young people. One of the things that I wrote about in the new version of the book, I was reflecting on some survey findings. There was a survey done by MTV of 14 to 21-year-olds and asking them questions about, and the survey was done in 2016, so it's certainly current. And they were asking students questions like, how do you feel about race relations in the United States? Or, what do you think? Lots of different questions. I'm not going to remember all the questions, but some of the answers were things like, we, this generation, we're more liberal, less prejudiced, right? Less prejudiced than our previous generations. And yet also, they talked about the fact that something like 70% reported having seen incidents of bias, right? So on the one hand, they said, we're more progressive, more inclusive, but also they saw these incidents of bias, and then they also said, but we can't talk about it, and talked about being afraid to have these conversations. And this was really interesting to me, and this finding is not just with young people, but older people as well. Today, a high percentage of white people, close to 50%, are saying that discrimination against white people is as much a problem as discrimination against people of color. It's kind of like saying 3 million people voted for voter fraud. You know what I mean? It's like there's no evidence. And mean, and that's the thing that's so striking, because there is no evidence. It's like, okay, well, why would anyone say discrimination against whites is as much a problem as discrimination against people of color, when there's no data to suggest that? I mean, there's no data to suggest it in terms of lending practices. There's no data to suggest it in terms of employment. There's no data to suggest it in terms of access to education. I mean, there's just no data. So where does that come from? I mean, I think it's a really interesting question for which I do not have an answer, but I think that it's really through dialogue that we help correct that misperception.
There's even resistance, though, to the dialogue. Mary and I, in the class that we teach, reference something that happened in Henrico County, which is outside of Richmond, my home. And there, a visitor from a local university tried to have an open conversation. And the pushback from many outspoken people in the community was, there are no problems here. You're starting trouble.
Yeah, people who talk about it are the problem. Yeah. No, that's
right. So the fact that you're
mm-hmm.
raising this issue is causing people to, you're widening the racial divide and you're creating the problem. Yeah. Don't stir the waters.
That's an increasingly common response. I mean, it's not like that's a new response. There are many people who have felt that way a long time. But in the post-Obama era, the so-called colorblind, post-racial, so-called post-racial era, that has been sort of the rhetoric that it's, that we are, quote, post-racial, no evidence of that, but that we are post-racial, and it's the people who keep talking about it, that we could be post-racial if you just stop talking about it. Mm-hmm. And of course I don't agree with that, but there are people who feel that way. Mm-hmm. But I want to lift up an example I learned about while I was working on the new version of my book. At the University of Mississippi, there's the Winter Institute for Racial Reconciliation, named after a progressive governor, William Winter. But anyway, the Winter Institute goes into communities and leads dialogues. But I want to say something about that. You can't have one dialogue in the afternoon and be done, right? You know what I mean? It has to be a sustained effort because, one, people have to get on the same page in terms of understanding, are you even talking about the same thing, really listening to each other. It takes time, getting past the awkwardness. And I often say, I'm going to come back to the Winter Institute, but I just want to say this. Sometimes it's like taking an antibiotic. If they give you if you've got an earache or something, you go to the doctor, they give you an antibiotic, they tell you you have to take this for 10 days. Right, you got to take it for 10 days. But the thing that you went for, let's say your earache, stops hurting after 2. So the temptation is to stop taking it, mm-hmm. right? You don't like it, it makes you feel yucky, you know what I mean? You don't want to take that medicine. And so you stop taking it, but what happens if you stop taking it? It comes back. And it comes back worse, right? Mm-hmm. Comes back and it comes back worse. And that's kind of what talking about race is like. If you start talking about it, you get some discomfort. If you keep talking about it, you will get past the discomfort and you'll actually start to make progress. But if people start and don't finish, they just get enough to say, this makes me feel uncomfortable, I'm not doing that anymore. And then it comes back worse. And they don't have the tools, except now they're like, yeah, I went to those workshops, I'm not going anymore, right? But the people who do it and sustain it over a period of time, students in my class, for example, certainly in the middle, they weren't having fun. But at the end, they were like, changed my life. This is the best thing. Am I right about that? And so it's like you get to a place where you start to see the benefit. But if you don't push yourself to the place where you start to see the benefit, it just keeps coming back worse. Mm-hmm. So the Winter Institute leads these community dialogues where they get people to commit and to do it long enough to see the benefit. Mm-hmm. And there was a story which I thought was so moving, Philadelphia, Mississippi. I don't know if you remember Philadelphia, Mississippi, but it was the site of a civil rights murder. And the person who did it, everybody knew it was a white Klansman, and everybody knew who had done it, but that person had never been brought to justice. And this history was sort of festering in the community. And the folks from the Winter Institute came to Philadelphia and led a series of dialogue sessions where people really listened to each other and began to understand how this crime, this unresolved crime, was sort of a cancer in the community. And the people who'd participated in the dialogue, multiracial group, decided that they needed to, as a result of the dialogue, decided that they needed to do something about it. And together, they lobbied the local law enforcement, the attorney general, or whoever that would have been, to reopen the case. And eventually, the person who everyone knew who it was brought to justice. And that was a direct result of that dialogue, and a real opportunity for the community to move forward in a healing way. So I think it's important.
Yeah.
That's really helpful for Mary and me, because in our class, we have people who want to stop taking the antibiotic
Yes.
in the middle because it is so uncomfortable. So that's
Yes.
really, I'm really grateful for that. Before we open it up
You're so kind. Thank
to
you.
them, are
Thank
you
you very
hopeful
much.
about the future? Should we be,
Thank
and
you.
why?
I was reading something recently, and I heard the phrase, maybe you're all familiar with it, from Paulo Freire's work. The phrase was critical hope. And so I would describe myself as critically hopeful. I think that progress is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I definitely feel like we're in a 1 step back moment. But if you're not hopeful, you would just, wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. So I think it is possible. I know personally that change is possible. I've witnessed it in my lifetime. I've witnessed it individually and collectively. So I know change is possible, and we're in need of some. So I'm hopeful that it can happen, though I don't think it will happen by itself. It's definitely it's going to require a focused effort.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much for entertaining Mary and my question.
Thank you for your
Yes.
questions.
Yeah, thank you.
But I know we're going to get some from the audience.
Now we
which
are,
I'm
so
really-
we just want to thank you for that.
I think you should give the guidance you usually give.
Okay, so
Okay, we've got
we
one,
now
right?
have mics. We're ready for the Q&A from the audience. There's 1 mic here and 1 mic in the center over here. But I will tell you at the onset that we are looking for questions. This is not a time to impress Beverly with your brilliance or to share your experience, really. We want to hear from lots of people. So what we are asking for are tweets. 140 characters or less, with a question mark at the end. Okay.
Sounds
And we have buzzers and people from the back that will come and get you and drag you away if you go over that. Okay.
All right.
So please just start by giving your name and who you are, and then your 140 characters. And we'll start with the wonderful. Are you first, Karen? Oh, this young lady. Okay. Because we want somebody who's going to model just what we want, and that's going to be you?
Yeah, so Diaway can do it.
So
No
you can
pressure.
do it. You can do it.
You can.
Is she Spelman?
She is.
She is mighty, mighty Spelman? Okay.
Yes.
My name is Diaway Benson, and I had the privilege of being a student under Dr. Tatum's wonderful leadership. Thank you so much for being here. And my question is, I'm thinking about the tension between affirming identity and allowing for freedom of speech on college campuses, and I wanted to hear your perspective on how do you think about allowing for divisive or hate speech on college campuses?
So
Perfect.
that's a great question.
Can we give her a round of applause for following instructions?
So, I think the answer to hate speech is more speech. And what I mean by that is, I do believe in freedom of speech, and we know that not all speech, I was thinking about this actually earlier today. I mean, someone can walk around spouting hateful stuff, and they have the right to do that, right? I have the right to do that. But why would I want to do that? Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't really understand why somebody wants to do that. But if someone is choosing to do that, within the law, they have the right to do that. But I think the response to that is to create space for other kinds of speech, as an antidote. So I, was not the president when. I'm happy to say I didn't have to deal with that at Spelman. But if there were a moment when someone was coming and I knew in advance that that person's speech was going to be disruptive, my strategy would be to create an alternative opportunity for people to hear from a different point of view, another point of view, a different kind of affirming speech. People talk about microaggressions. There are also microaffirmations, right? And so, so I think that it is possible to create, to recognize that there will be that kind of speech sometimes. Hopefully we'll create a community where people will want to engage in that. But if they do, then let's talk more about why that's not the kind of community we want to be.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for being here, Dr. Tatum. My name is Aaron Boslin, and I'm in the Education Policy and Management program here. And I'm curious, when you first started giving talks in the late 90s, early 2000s, based on why are all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria, and when you think about those talks and you think about now, how different are the questions you get now compared to 20 years ago, and why do you think that is?
They're not that different, I'm sad to say. There are some questions that are different, right? The vocabulary has changed. People ask about intersectionality. They didn't ask about that in 1997. But it's just not that different. And I think some of that has to do with, generational issues. For example, if you're on a college campus, the population, you lose 25% of your population every year, and then you get an influx of new people who haven't had those conversations yet. So, so you're constantly repeating yourself just because of that. But the questions aren't that different. And that's part of, the reflecting on the last 20 years. It hasn't been, it's an interesting thing to think about. Let me just say this. If you were born in 1997, think about this. You're 20 years old in 2017. If you were born in 1997, you were 11 years old when President Obama was elected, and you were 11 years old when the economy collapsed, right, in 2008. You were 15 years old when Trayvon Martin was killed. You were 17 when the Ferguson, Michael Brown and Ferguson happened. You were 19 when our current president was elected. And so that, the stuff of progress has not really been part of your lived experience. You might say, well, the election of President Obama was progress, and certainly I don't want to say it wasn't, but the backlash that came after his election was really very powerful in terms of the negative attitudes being articulated and all of that. So, when I think of, my coming of age, it was all about social progress. But if you're 20 years old today, mostly it's not about that. And that's part of the challenge.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Karen?
Hi, Beverly. This is Karen Mapp, and thank you for being here. I'm a professor here at the Ed School, and thank you for your interview, by the way, with us for the TFA case we're writing. We appreciate that. My question is, we are starting to think about core courses here at the Ed School, and one of those core courses is going to be around diversity, equity, inclusion. Besides your work, what materials would you put at the top of the list that we should offer up in a course like that, or what experiences do you think we should offer up in a course like that?
Okay, so I've read a lot of really great stuff that, part of, when you're president, you don't have time to do that much reading, right? So after my presidency ended, I spent a lot of time, just reviewing the literature, stuff that had been written in the last few years that I hadn't had time to read while I was president. And one of the books I have to say some of what I read is depressing, and that's just the nature of where we are at the moment, but a wonderful book is called Reproducing Racism by Daria Roithmeyer, who is a legal scholar. And the subtitle of it is How Everyday Choices Lock in White Advantage. And it's just really, if you don't understand racism as a system of advantage, you will after you read Reproducing Racism. Another great book that I read, also by a legal scholar, that's by Ian Haney Lopez, Dog Whistle Politics, which was really interesting reading in the context of the recent election. But again, it sort of helps you understand how the rhetoric of our society reinforces certain ideas, even when people are not using a racially obvious language, it's sort of the racial coding that happens. And so that was a really good book. I found that one really useful. And of course, I'm sure, you think about the new Jim Crow, for example, mass incarceration. That's many people are familiar with that book. But in terms of experiences, I think just I don't know what the makeup of your course will be demographically, but the opportunity to engage with people whose life experiences is different from your own in sustained dialogue cannot be underestimated. I think that that's really important. Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Naima Kennedy, and I'm a Boston Public School teacher. I teach middle school, so I really appreciated hearing that, the story you told earlier, that your students were questioning why they didn't have these conversations in middle school.
Yes.
And so as I begin having these conversations with my students, who are predominantly Black and Latino, I guess my question is more so, how should I start that conversation? I am always encouraging my students to question everything that they hear, but race right now for them is critical, and I want them to begin questioning it and start having these conversations now. So how should I go about
as a
doing
middle
that?
school teacher, what is your subject area?
So I actually teach civics. So right now we are talking about the desegregation of Central High School, and we have been talking a lot about race and racism as that comes up in that curriculum. But I feel like I would like to go a little deeper with them because they can do it. And I feel that a lot of people think that our students are too fragile and they can't go that deep at that age. And I disagree with that.
Well, I would disagree too. Certainly one of the things that I would say, though, is that, when you talk about race with children of any age, you have to think developmentally. Right? So, what's appropriate for 4-year-olds is not going to be what's appropriate for 14-year-olds, et cetera. So you have to think developmentally, but I think that it's also very important to think about, particularly if you're teaching primarily kids of color, to think about how that conversation can be an empowering conversation as opposed to a depressing one. Right? So, that's true for white students as well, but obviously, if you're talking about issues of race for folks who are the targets of the racism, then I think it's really important to lift up how one resists that, resistance to oppression, right? And to also make visible allies. Because I think, there is a history of ally behavior in the United States, past and present, and so we want to help people understand that yes, these are problems and you can be empowered to work against it, but you don't have to do it all by yourself. There are also people who will work in partnership with you. And seeing those examples in history as well as finding those examples, contemporary examples, I think is really important.
Hi, I'm Catherine, and I'm a school head in California. I want to offer my thanks too. I feel very honored to get to listen to you today. As a school leader and a person of color, I take on a lot of conversations about race, and I'd love to ask you about words of wisdom, as you've been a school leader yourself, how you manage when people say things like, where's the direction of the school, or what's the agenda of the school leader when she keeps engaging in conversations about race?
Okay, so I think that this is a great question, so thank you for asking it. And there's two things I want to say. One is, self-care, right? You have to talk about how you take care of yourself in that role, because obviously it's demanding and stressful and has this extra layer of stress because as a woman of color in that role, having to deal with, it didn't describe the demographics of your school, but having to deal perhaps with white parents who are not understanding where you're coming from, or even sometimes parents of color. And so the first thing I want to say around self-care, and this is for anyone trying to do social justice work, if you make a lot of withdrawals, you better make a lot of deposits. So that's
Well
just,
said.
I can't take credit for that. A friend of mine said it to me. And so, but it has been really important to me throughout, he said it to me in 1991, and I keep repeating it, withdrawals, better make those deposits. So that said, I would go back to the mission of your institution. What is the mission statement? Every school has one, and usually it says something about leadership development and preparing citizens and, that kind of language. And so if you've got that kind of language, I would say, I am living out the mission of my institution. We are here to develop the next generation of leaders in the 21st century. You better know how to engage with people differently from yourself. And in order to be effective in that way, you need to be able to talk about issues like race, class, sexual orientation, other sources of difference, and that's what I'm here to do. Thank you for your question.
Hi, my name is Johnny Cole. I am currently only in my second year as an assistant principal at Needham High School, just outside of Boston.
Sure.
We're a MECO district, so we have students of color coming in out from Boston. We also have a small resident population. So I spent 13 years in the classroom and am now a brand new administrator, and I am having trouble grappling with putting policies in place and programming decisions that use race to try to dismantle some of the systems of inequity that were built using race, and then running into the sort of legal challenges that are telling us we can't use race to dismantle these things. So I guess my question is just how do we do it? How do we find a race-neutral way through the eyes of the law to do this work?
That is a good question, and I don't know that I have an answer. It is challenging, it's increasingly so, and I was having a conversation with someone not long ago about a practice that I think is a best practice that was causing concern. And so I'm just going to speak very generically, but the practice has to do with, if you've got a small number of kids of color in a largely white environment, does it make sense to cluster those kids so that they're not isolated, or do you put one here, one here, one here, one here, everybody's a token? So if you understand the social psychology of tokenism, you would say better to cluster, right? But if you cluster, someone might say, well, you're treating the kids differently on the basis of race. And so you have to think about how do you help. If somebody sues you, then, you need some legal assistance. I'm not a lawyer. But I would, but I do think one can make the case that in order to ensure that each kid has access to a quality experience, you need to take into consideration the group dynamics. I think that's defensible. And so, but I think my experience is that sometimes you really have to help people understand the logic of what you're doing. You can't just do it and say, well, this is why we're doing it. You really have to help people understand the experience and the logic of that, which is why I keep coming back to, it's not like afternoon professional development. You know what I mean? It's a more extended dialogue. I hope that helps. I know it's thorny. Yeah.
Good evening, Dr. Tatum.
Good evening.
My name is Eric Rowe, principal at Prep Academy.
Uh-huh.
So part of our mission is, as a school, is to dismantle systems of power and privilege in our school and community. We serve students who are expelled from different public schools. We serve students from group homes. We serve juvenile sex offenders. And we even serve students who are pushed out of other schools. So we take those kids in as well. My question is, I'm leaning into these conversations with team that have been doing this for a few years. My question is, once we get past the sustained dialogue, sort of that next step of action, of really doing that, because that's the struggle. Like, that struggle is real right now for the team. Let's try to create an affirming school, but also maybe trying to push and change practices of the team. So long question, but like, how do you make that next leap?
Well, so without getting into the particulars of your school, which I'm hearing you've got a challenging population, and
kids are fine. It's the adults. Yes.
I'm going to say it again. I'm hearing you've got a challenging population. And so, and you haven't been real specific about that population, but without getting into the specifics of your particular situation, what I want to say is that dialogue, for its own sake, is not useful. Right? So I hope that that's sort of implied in what I've been saying, but I want to make it explicit. Dialogue should lead to action. Right? Like the Philadelphia, Mississippi dialogue led to action, right? So, let's talk about what the concerns and questions are and dialogue about them, and then figure out what our strategy is going to be. You know what I mean? So in my psychology of racism class, to just use that as an example, we'd spend the semester, I always structured it. It's interesting you said, the now what. What, so what, now what? Right? So what is racism? How do we understand that? How does it impact us? The so what is, how does it impact us? And in terms of identity development and all of that. And then there was always a now what component. And the now what component was an assignment for the students to identify a concern relative to the topic that they had and to develop an action plan. And they didn't have to implement their action plan, because I always felt as a faculty member that was beyond my purview to say, you must take this social action. But it seemed to me not unreasonable to say you have to design a plan. Whether you implement it or not is on you, right? But you have to come up with a plan. And so the students would come up with plans. Sometimes those plans were, family intervention over Thanksgiving. Sometimes the plan was, educational workshop in my residence hall. Maybe it was a letter writing campaign. Maybe it was, something else. But the idea was, there are lots of different ways of taking action. And so, whatever it is that you're working on and having dialogue about, at the end of the day, you want an action plan. And so that's what I would say. Now, once you are moving toward action, sometimes your actions don't go the way you hope they will. You have to revisit and try again. But it's just like anything else. I mean, if you are leading an organization, not every idea I had at Spelman was a good one, and not every good idea came from me, right? That it's a community and we're working together towards certain goals. But if you're clear about what your mission is, then it's relatively easy to assess, is this moving us toward our goal or not? I hope that's helpful.
It was.
Thank you. Yeah.
So I think as we try to be on time, we are coming to the end of the time that we can be together. So what I wanted to ask is for the three people that are remaining to just share their questions succinctly, and we'll give Dr. Tatum the opportunity to try to respond to
all
them.
Three. Perfect.
All three of them together. So.
Hi, Beverly. It's Claudia Foxtree. It's been a long time.
A long time, Claudia.
5 kids later, I'm still teaching in the same district, and this year the school is doing some great work with faculty education, and we've gone through the Helms and Cross racial identity models, and I was just wondering if you'd updated your file folders and have a new go-to or favorite racial identity researcher or model.
So William Cross has modified his, oh, I'm supposed to get all three, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I'm
Oh,
coming
it's
back
okay.
to that. Thank you for your question.
Okay.
Andre?
Hi, Dr. Tatum. I'm Andre Morgan, a student in the Doctor of Education Leadership program. I have a vocabulary clarification question. What is the difference between saying racist or racism and racial bias?
Racist, R-A-C-I-S-T, racism
Yes.
or racial bias. Okay, thank you. Okay.
Hello, I'm Raven Stubbs, a master's student here, and my question is particularly in research institutions. How would you advise educators to move forward when the students of colors are telling experience in the classes that makes their theory or potentially their lesson plans or pedagogy a moot point?
Okay. I'm not sure I completely understood. So could you say your question again?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was saying, particularly in research institutions, how would you advise educators to move forward when in their classrooms, students of color are telling experiences that makes their research or their pedagogy irrelevant?
Or certainly
Or
challenges it.
disproving it?
Yeah, I got you. Okay. All right, so I'm going to just do a lightning speed response.
Yeah.
Okay, so to the question about Cross and Helms, let me just say William Cross's thinking has evolved, and in the new version of my book, I talk about the ways in which it has evolved, and so I'm going to say, check out the new book when it comes out. And relative to I'm going to the last question first. So, when somebody's got a theory, and it's maybe based on experiences in certain communities. Let's say somebody's done research in white communities and they've got a theory about whatever it is. And then someone who's from a different community, African American community, or maybe even an African American from that same white community, but who's got a different life experience, challenges it. In an ideal world, the researcher would take that feedback and see how it makes their theory expand or adjust it. I am certainly conscious of the fact that sometimes people don't respond that way. Sometimes they respond by like, I'm right and you need to just be quiet. And in which case that is a very difficult position for a student to be in. And I still think the questions need to be asked. And sometimes you need a different advisor. I'm just saying. And it's unfortunate that the student is the one who suffers under that circumstance, but that is the nature of hierarchical institutions. But it helps if you have, faculty allies. For those faculty who know what you're talking about, it helps if you have faculty allies. The three terms you mentioned, racist, racism, racial bias. Racism, I define, system of advantage based on race. The term racist is actually a word that I don't use very often. And the reason I don't use it very often is because it just shuts people down and it doesn't really move the conversation forward. It's not, when a teacher a long time ago, white teacher a long time ago said that when someone called her a racist, she felt like I asked her, how does that make you feel? She said, I feel like I've been punched in the stomach. And then people just shut down and get defensive. They don't hear anything else after that. It's like they can't process the information. So even if you think somebody is being racist, I find in my own strategy that it's not that productive to start with that sentence. That was a racist thing. You could say, I am concerned about what you just said. You can talk about what your concerns are without ever using the R word. And I sometimes get asked to be, I get interviewed by media sometimes. Somebody's done something outrageous and somebody will want to say, do you think that was racist? And I will rarely say, yes, I think it was racist, because I think it just shuts down the conversation. I think that you can talk about why it's problematic, what you think is wrong with it, all of that. And racial bias is like a more polite way of describing racist behavior. That's, polite, I want to take back that word polite. It's a word, if you describe it as racial bias, I don't think it's less powerful If somebody engages in behavior that you think is racially biased, you can call it that. I think you're more likely to move the conversation forward if you describe it as racial bias as opposed to racist. It's just a matter of semantics in a way. That's how I think about it.
So, you have shared brilliant thoughts, and you've certainly engaged us in being more thoughtful. And the hour and a half has sped by. I know that people want to get to thank you and talk to you individually, but on behalf of Mary and myself and all those assembled, we earnestly thank you for your time with us and your work.
Thank you so much. Oh, it's a pleasure.
Group hug.
Group hug.
Thank you.
This is all for you.
So, thank you all for being here. Will you be willing to stay for a few minutes? Just a few minutes, okay. All right. For the participants in the Institute, we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. What time?
So have you stayed in touch with anything from Raise Your Hand Texas the last bit, or?
A moment now or no? Okay, thanks. Yeah, so it's someone that I have seen in a number of years. And we were talking to from PR company.